There is something the world has always misunderstood about people who genuinely prefer solitude. Others often assume that anyone who enjoys being alone must secretly be lonely, emotionally wounded, antisocial, depressed, or hiding from life itself. They treat solitude like a symptom instead of a preference, like evidence that something inside the person is broken and waiting to be repaired through more social interaction. People ask if you are okay simply because you enjoy your own company. They assume isolation must automatically mean sadness. But psychology tells a far more nuanced story. For many individuals, solitude is not emotional failure, avoidance, or fear pretending to be independence. It is the environment where their nervous system finally stops straining under constant stimulation and emotional pressure. Some people simply process the world at a much deeper level than others. Noise feels louder, social interaction feels heavier, and emotional atmospheres linger inside them long after everyone else has already moved on. Because of this, being around people continuously can become mentally exhausting in ways that are almost invisible from the outside. Solitude becomes the place where the mind finally slows down enough to breathe normally again. It is where overstimulation settles, emotional overload softens, and the body no longer has to monitor so many layers of information at once. What many people call withdrawal is often emotional regulation. What looks like distance is sometimes the nervous system protecting its own balance. These individuals are not rejecting humanity. They simply feel more psychologically clear, emotionally stable, and internally connected when they have space away from constant external demands. Their solitude is not emptiness. It is restoration. It is the place where they can exist without performing, absorbing, or constantly adapting themselves to the energy of the world around them. One of the deepest traits explored in the video is something psychology describes as deep processing sensitivity. Some people do not simply move through life experiencing events and quickly leaving them behind. Their mind stays with everything longer. Conversations continue replaying internally hours after they end. Small emotional shifts in someone's voice or expression keep echoing quietly in the background of their thoughts. A single uncomfortable interaction can remain mentally active for days because the mind keeps turning it over, examining it from different angles, searching for meaning beneath what was immediately visible on the surface. These individuals are not overreacting or intentionally overthinking. Their nervous system is simply built to process information at a far deeper level than most people realize. Psychology connects this to heightened sensory processing, stronger emotional reactivity, deeper cognitive reflection, and increased awareness of subtle details that many others unconsciously filter out. Because of this, the world arrives to them at a much higher emotional and psychological volume. A crowded room does not only feel noisy, it feels visually overwhelming, emotionally layered, socially demanding, and mentally saturated all at once. Every expression, shift in tone, tension in atmosphere, and emotional undercurrent quietly enters the nervous system, whether they want it to or not. Even ordinary days contain far more information for them than the same day contains for someone whose processing remains more surface level. Over time, this creates a kind of invisible exhaustion that most people never notice from the outside. By the end of prolonged time around people, they are not simply tired in the normal sense. They feel emotionally and cognitively depleted, as though their mind has been carrying too much stimulation without pause for too long. This is why solitude becomes emotionally necessary rather than optional. Being alone is where the nervous system finally slows down enough to finish processing everything it has been absorbing all day. It is where the mind can stop receiving new emotional input long enough to integrate what is already there. Solitude is not escape from life for these individuals. It is recovery space for a nervous system that processes life more deeply than most people ever realize. Another trait explored in the video is something far more difficult to explain because it happens almost invisibly inside the nervous system. Highly sensitive people do not simply notice emotions in others, they absorb them. Someone else's anxiety, sadness, frustration, grief, emotional tension, or quiet discomfort does not remain outside of them for long. It enters the body almost automatically and settles there without permission. Psychology often describes this as emotional contagion combined with deep empathic sensitivity, but for people who experience it intensely, it feels much heavier than ordinary empathy. They walk into a room and immediately sense emotional atmospheres most people never consciously register. A person may speak calmly while carrying hidden anxiety underneath their tone, and somehow the nervous system detects the contradiction before the mind fully understands it. Someone may smile politely while carrying exhaustion or grief beneath the surface, and part of them quietly absorbs that sadness without realizing why their own emotional state suddenly changed. Even subtle interpersonal tension between other people can create uneasiness inside them long before any conflict becomes visible externally. This constant emotional absorption becomes exhausting because the nervous system rarely has clear boundaries separating my feelings from what I absorbed from everyone around me. After spending time with people, even people they genuinely care about, they often leave carrying emotional residue that was never originally theirs. A perfectly normal social interaction can leave them strangely heavy, overstimulated, or emotionally crowded for hours afterward. The difficult part is that most other people never notice this process happening, so the need for solitude often looks excessive or confusing from the outside. But solitude is not simply preference for these individuals. It is emotional recovery. It is the place where the nervous system finally stops receiving emotional input long enough to separate their authentic feelings from everything unconsciously absorbed throughout the day. Alone, the emotional noise slowly settles. The mind becomes quieter. The body softens. They can finally locate what actually belongs to them beneath all the emotions they were silently carrying for everyone else. This is why time alone feels so psychologically necessary for deeply sensitive people. Without solitude, the nervous system remains overloaded by emotional information that never fully had space to leave. Being alone is often the only moment where their internal world becomes emotionally clear again, instead of crowded by the invisible weight of everyone around them. Another important trait explored in the video is the quiet exhaustion that comes from surface-level social interaction. These individuals are not necessarily drained by people themselves. What truly exhausts them is interaction that looks like connection on the outside, but never becomes emotionally real underneath. They can sit through hours of polite conversation, smile at the right moments, participate socially, and appear completely engaged while internally feeling strangely empty the entire time. Small talk, performative friendliness, obligatory socializing, and emotionally shallow interaction often leave them feeling more disconnected afterward rather than less. Psychology links this to a strong preference for meaningful substantive connection over ambient social presence. What they are searching for is not simply company or stimulation. They are searching for genuine emotional contact moments where something real is actually being expressed and truly understood. They want conversations that move beneath performance, beneath automatic social scripts, beneath the endless exchange of safe surface-level information. Because of this, they often experience a very specific kind of loneliness that appears even while surrounded by people. It is the loneliness of being socially included but emotionally unseen. Over time, repeated experiences of shallow interaction become deeply tiring because they require constant social participation without providing the emotional depth the nervous system actually craves. These individuals can usually perform well socially when necessary, but doing so often feels like quietly acting in a role rather than existing naturally. Part of the exhaustion comes from sensing that everyone is interacting through carefully managed versions of themselves, while the deeper emotional truth underneath remains untouched. This creates a painful feeling that something important is always missing. Eventually, solitude begins to feel emotionally more honest than many social environments, because at least when alone, there is no pressure to perform connection that does not feel real. Alone, they no longer have to navigate the disappointment of spending hours around people while still feeling psychologically distant from them. Solitude becomes comforting not because they hate connection, but because false connection drains them more deeply than physical aloneness ever could. What they truly long for is not more interaction but rarer forms of intimacy, where both people are emotionally present enough to meet each other beyond the social surface. Another important trait explored in the video is the presence of an unusually rich and emotionally sustaining inner world. Many deeply introspective people do not experience solitude as emptiness because their internal life remains psychologically active even when nothing external is happening. Their mind is constantly filled with reflection, emotional analysis, imagination, memory, symbolism, philosophical thought, quiet observation, and ideas that continue unfolding long after other people would have stopped thinking about them. Psychology often describes this as high introspective capacity combined with strong absorption into internal mental experience. These individuals are not sitting alone waiting for real life to begin again. Their inner world itself feels alive, layered, and emotionally engaging in ways that many external environments cannot easily replicate. Thoughts connect to memories, emotions connect to meaning, and small observations slowly develop into deeper understanding over time. Because of this, solitude becomes not the absence of stimulation, but a different kind of stimulation entirely quieter, slower, and more naturally aligned with how their mind actually functions. When they are alone, mental clarity often increases. Feelings become easier to understand. Parts of themselves that disappear beneath social noise quietly return to the surface. External environments constantly demand attention toward other people, conversations, emotional monitoring, and social performance, which pulls energy away from the inner world where these individuals feel most psychologically connected to themselves. Alone, that energy finally returns inward again. This is why spending long periods in solitude can leave them feeling nourished rather than deprived. They are not escaping reality. They are reconnecting with a form of inner experience that genuinely sustains them emotionally. Many people misunderstand this because they assume everyone experiences silence as boredom or emptiness. But for deeply introspective individuals, silence often contains enormous psychological richness. Their relationship with their own mind becomes a real source of comfort, meaning, creativity, emotional regulation, and identity. Solitude allows them to think without interruption, feel without performance, and exist without constantly translating themselves into socially acceptable forms. What nourishes them most is not constant stimulation from the outside world, but uninterrupted access to the depth of their own inner life. For many people, the preference for solitude is not shaped only by personality or natural introversion. It is also shaped by emotional experience and nervous system adaptation developed over years of unpredictability. The video explains that some individuals grew up in environments where emotional consistency never fully existed. Love, attention, safety, or emotional availability could change suddenly depending on someone else's mood. One moment the atmosphere felt warm and calm, and the next it became distant, tense, critical, or emotionally unavailable without warning. In environments like this, the nervous system learns very early that being around other people requires constant emotional monitoring in order to stay psychologically safe. Children begin reading the room automatically, watching facial expressions, tone shifts, body language, and emotional atmospheres long before they fully understand what they are doing. They learn to adjust themselves constantly, speak carefully, minimize their needs, suppress emotions, and avoid becoming emotionally inconvenient for others. Psychology connects this to nervous system adaptations, formed through emotional inconsistency and chronic self-monitoring. Over time, social proximity stops feeling naturally safe because being around people becomes psychologically associated with effort, tension, unpredictability, and emotional management. The body never fully relaxes around others because part of the nervous system remains quietly alert, preparing for emotional shifts that might suddenly happen again. Solitude becomes important because it is often the only environment where this monitoring process finally stops completely. Alone. There is nobody to emotionally manage, nobody to adjust around, nobody whose mood must constantly be tracked for safety. The nervous system finally softens because it no longer needs to remain hyper-aware of emotional unpredictability. This is why solitude can feel much deeper than simple preference. For some individuals, it becomes emotional home, the one place where they can exist without performing, adapting, suppressing themselves, or carrying the invisible tension of emotional vigilance. They did not consciously decide to need less from people. They learned to, because depending too heavily on emotionally inconsistent environments once felt painful or unsafe. Over years, the body began associating solitude with calmness, authenticity, and relief, while associating closeness with effort and emotional uncertainty. What many people interpret as distance is often the nervous system trying to protect itself, using the only strategy that once reliably created peace. For many people who deeply prefer solitude, being alone eventually becomes more than comfort or rest. It becomes protection for the most authentic parts of who they truly are. The video explains that there is often a version of the self that only fully appears in solitude. The version that thinks without editing, feels without suppressing emotion, reflects without interruption, and exists without constantly adjusting itself for social acceptance. Alone, They no longer need to carefully monitor how much emotion is appropriate, how much complexity others can tolerate, or whether their inner world is becoming too much for the people around them. The mind becomes quieter, more honest, and emotionally unfiltered. This private self often feels more real than the socially managed version presented to the outside world. But the reason this authenticity becomes so closely tied to solitude is usually connected to earlier emotional experiences. Many deeply sensitive people learned that vulnerability carried consequences. Their emotions may have been misunderstood, dismissed, minimized, judged, or simply never fully received at the depth they were trying to express them. Over time, the nervous system quietly learns that visibility itself can feel emotionally dangerous. Being truly seen no longer feels naturally safe because past experiences taught them that openness could lead to rejection, invalidation, or emotional disappointment. Solitude therefore becomes a psychological refuge where the most real parts of the self remain protected from misunderstanding. Alone, there is no need to perform, translate, simplify, or emotionally defend who they are. The deepest layers of the self finally feel safe enough to exist freely. However, the video also highlights the hidden cost of this protection. When authenticity only exists in isolation, genuine emotional intimacy slowly begins to feel risky instead of nourishing. Connection becomes associated with exposure, while solitude becomes associated with emotional safety. Over time, the person may start protecting themselves so thoroughly that nobody ever truly reaches the deepest parts of them anymore. Solitude preserves authenticity, but it can also quietly imprison it. The very self being protected may slowly become emotionally unreachable to others, leaving the individual safe from misunderstanding, but also painfully unseen in the process. The final message of the video is deeply compassionate and quietly hopeful. It explains that deeply sensitive and introspective people are not broken, antisocial, emotionally cold, or incapable of intimacy simply because they need solitude more than others do. Their nervous system is not searching for less connection. It is searching for a different kind of connection entirely. They were never designed for endless shallow interaction, constant stimulation, or relationships built only on social performance. What they truly long for is emotional depth, honesty, patience, stillness, and psychological safety. The healthiest relationships for them often feel surprisingly similar to solitude itself. Calm instead of overwhelming. Genuine instead of performative. Safe instead of emotionally demanding. In those rare connections, they no longer feel pressure to shrink themselves, monitor every emotion, or carefully edit who they are in order to remain accepted. The video emphasizes that solitude and intimacy are not opposites. Real intimacy should eventually feel like an extension of the same emotional safety they experience when alone. The goal was never to force themselves into becoming endlessly social or emotionally available to everyone. The goal was to eventually find people capable of meeting them at the depth where their authentic self naturally exists. Healing begins when connection no longer feels like danger, exhaustion, or performance. It begins when solitude stops being the only safe place the nervous system knows. Deep people do not need more people. They need safer people, slower people, emotionally honest people, people who can sit quietly beside the truth of who they are without asking them to become smaller, simpler, or easier to understand.